course you know all about Hogwarts.
Sorry, no.
No? Blimey, Harry, didn't you ever wonder where your mum and dad learned it all?
Learned what?
You're a wizard, Harry.
I can't even make a meme out of that. It's just so iconic. Hey everyone, my name is Michael, and welcome to the Nerdscape, where today we're going to continue our journey through the Harry Potter series with chapter-by-chapter analysis. In today's episode, we're going to cover chapters 3, 4, and 5 of Sorcerer's Stone. These chapters are iconic in their own way and rich with detail, so without further ado, let's get into it. But first, this is going to be a spoiler warning. I will be discussing all published books in the main Harry Potter series, as they relate to each other. Pottermore, Fantastic Beasts, Cursed Child, and anything else I can think of to enrich this discussion. So, we start off chapter 3, The Letters from No One, to remind us yet again that Harry's life still sucks. He wasn't, for lack of a better term, ungrounded from his punishment after the incident with the snake until after his summer vacation had already begun. Considering the fact that we end this chapter on July 31st, we can use some amount of context clues to say that the narrative of this chapter starts around July 23rd, 1991. This doesn't really matter, but it's just a fun fact. Also, Rowling apparently is using a fictional calendar here, as Harry says his birthday would be on a Tuesday, however July 31st is a Wednesday in 1991. Again, doesn't mean all that much, just a fun fact. At the beginning of this chapter, Harry is spending the majority of his summer avoiding Dudley and his gang of bullies who like to hunt him down and beat him up when they see him. However, now he has a light at the end of the tunnel for his miserable life. Dudley has been accepted to the private school Smeltings, while Harry has been slotted to attend Stonewall High. This means, for the first time ever, Dudley wouldn't be around to keep friends away from Harry, thus giving this poor kid the opportunity to have anything remotely happy. So, on or around July 23rd, the Dursleys are eating breakfast when the mail comes, and Harry is forced to go get it from the mail slot. There is nothing of importance in this mail pile. I don't know why you keep on making concern with this, JK. I mean, it's just a bill and a letter from Aunt Marge, and oh, I see. The plot is in this mail. Yes, this is the first letter from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry in the series, posted to Mr. H. Potter, cupboard number 4, Privet Drive. Now, I like to think, and this is just my headcanon, that McGonagall, who's the one that sends out the letters every year, was specifically doing this to fuck with the Dursleys. In Book 6, we see that Dumbledore specifically went to Tom Riddle to explain the situation, and we know that Muggleborns who get accepted into Hogwarts generally have a professor that will accompany the letter to explain to Muggle parents everything. As this doesn't happen with Harry initially, I just like to think that McGonagall is purposely just making the Dursleys sweat a little. Regardless if that was her intention, it certainly works, and now we enter into one of the funniest bits in the entire series, the slow descent into madness of Vernon Dursley. Vernon does not allow Harry to read the letter, citing that him and Petunia swore to squash the magic out of him. Interestingly though, Petunia mentions that she thinks the best course of action would be to write Hogwarts back, stating that as Harry's guardians, they don't want him to attend Hogwarts. We know that Petunia had actually written Dumbledore requesting the inverse of this when she wanted to go to school with Lily, so it's just a good bit of character building that doesn't really pay off for 7 books. Now, since the letter had mentioned that Harry was occupying the cupboard, Vernon moves Harry to the second bedroom upstairs that Dudley had been using as storage for his broken and spare toys. This, of course, does nothing, as the next day the letter comes, once again addressed to Harry in the smallest bedroom. After beating Harry and Dudley back, Vernon again takes this letter, and now Vernon starts to take even more drastic action. The next morning, Harry, determined to get his letter out of sheer curiosity at this point, wakes up early and sneaks downstairs to the mail slot, guaranteeing he would be the first person to get his hands on the mail. Unfortunately, Vernon had decided to sleep in front of it to circumvent this, which, by the way, does that mean he spent the entire night sleeping on the hallway floor? I mean, yeah, probably. It's just, come on, man. You're already starting to slip. Also, it seems Vernon has forsaken any kind of work schedule at this point. He certainly is not going to work. Now, he starts to nail up the mail slot, and now, my humble listeners, when you board up your mail slot to prevent your orphan of a nephew from attending the magical school, you probably use a hammer, right? I mean, hammers are used to hammer things. That's where you're wrong, my friends. Silly you. You should be using the patented Vernon Dursley method of fruitcake hammering. Where did this fruitcake come from? No idea. Why is it so hard that it can be used as a construction tool? No idea. Now, but Vernon, he's just losing his mind. And the next day, when the letters get to the house by slipping into the cracks in the doors, he starts hammering those things up too, presumably with a fruitcake. Now, at this point, I'm 100% sure McGonagall is just fucking with them, because she sends 24 letters to Harry by magically putting them inside 2 dozen of eggs that the Dursleys had delivered to them through the window for some reason. I mean, their doors are boarded up, that's why, but you would think the delivery guy would just not. But anyway, now these letters promptly get shredded in the food processor, but the next day is Sunday, which thankfully means that there is no mail delivery, and Vernon can relax. Good times. Gets to have tea with the family. Enjoyed the Lord's Day. Truly wonderful. Unfortunately, the Wizarding world does not comply with mandatory mailman days off, and even if they do, Professor Minerva McGonagall simply does not care. Thus, about 100 letters shoot from the fireplace. Harry, who I might remind you is in Gryffindor and not a Ravenclaw, does not manage to get some of these letters somehow and is thrown into the hallway. At this point, Vernon has officially temporarily gone mad and off the deep end. He orders his family to pack up a few nights' worth of clothes and get in the car, determined to run. After berating Dudley, who, by the way, through all this is having his worst possible time because his parents are way more focused on keeping Harry away from the letters than pampering Dudley, he gets berated for trying to pack his TV and computer, but after that, they're on the run. Vernon seems to think that wizards are driving behind them and tracking him because he seems to be driving in no particular direction for a very long time, and then he just suddenly switches directions to quote-unquote shake them off. We know that in the end they end up in the fictional town of Cokeworth. Interestingly though, Spinner's End, as well as Petunia and Lily's home neighborhood, is in Cokeworth. Being that it's a fictional place, we can't really tell exactly how far away Cokeworth is from Privet Drive, but we know it's more of an industrial town than Surrey, and given that Vernon drove nearly an entire day to get there, we can hypothesize that it's most likely in central to north central England. However, the letters still end up at the hotel in Cokeworth, and thus, the next morning, Vernon is on the move again. This time driving them all to a coastline, disappearing for a bit, which again, he just locks his entire family in an unknown place. He locks them in the car in an unknown place. Like, come on, man. You're trying to keep them safe, but you're doing dumb stuff. But anyway, he returns with a long package, which is obviously a shotgun. However, Vernon says they're going to use a rowboat provided by the local innkeeper to go to a small little cabin just offshore. By the way, it's storming awfully at this point, and they're going to row a boat off into the water, making this probably the dumbest thing and the most dangerous thing that Vernon Dursley ever does, but hey, you keep on doing you big guy. But they do make it to the small damn 2-room cabin by nightfall, where they feast on a bag of chips and bananas before bed. Vernon seems to think that there's no way that anybody from Hogwarts can get a hold of them now and is comfortable sleeping here. As the clock on Dudley's watch ticks closer to midnight, and thus Harry's 11th birthday, he starts thinking about who the letter senders are again, and ways he can retrieve them. There had to be a way, but then the clock strikes midnight, and a great crash reverberates to the room. Somebody had come to deliver the letter to Harry in person. And so we enter into Chapter 4, The Keeper of Keys. A giant busts through the door of the cabin, much to the chagrin of Vernon, who had come downstairs with his shotgun. The giant, Hagrid of course, sits down and requests tea. Very British of you, Hagrid. Keep up the good work. He insults the Dursleys at large, calling Dudley fat, and when Vernon threatens him with the shotgun, he simply bends it into a knot without much problem. He introduces himself to Harry very kindly, though, emptying his pockets of sausage, pokers, cups, and pretty much anything else you might think that would be weird out of his coat. Hagrid begins his warpath of a chapter. Also, just as a side note, in this chapter, Hagrid mentions more than once he would prefer something stronger than tea, and even on one occasion drinks something that is certainly alcoholic. Like my brother Hagrid, can you just go to rehab or an AA meeting or something? I'll support you, because this is not the last time you're going to be drinking in this series. Well, anyway, he introduces himself to Harry with a birthday cake and his name, Rubeus Hagrid, Keeper of Keys and Grounds at Hogwarts. Now, bless his kind little heart, Harry is not used to being treated with any kind of respect or kindness, and I'm definitely reading too much into it here, but I love how polite Harry is to Hagrid. This great behemoth of a man just turned a loaded shotgun into a French horn, basically, and Harry is just being the sweetest boy. He also does not believe himself special or worthy enough to be a wizard, let alone a famous one. This humility is probably a result of the Dursleys completely destroying his self-esteem, but also we see this humility all throughout the series. For an example of which, when he's selected for the Triwizard Tournament and thinks he's nothing in comparison to Cedric, Flirt, or Crumb. But yeah, guys, no, he's just the main character syndrome, totally, yeah. But anyway, Harry confesses he doesn't know what Hogwarts is. This does not please Hagrid. He rears up at the Dursleys, making them cower in fear. How dare they not tell Harry his heritage? How dare they keep Harry away from his true world? For me, the reader, though, and I'm skipping around a bit, I think the worst thing that the Dursleys do in this chapter is how blatantly they insult Lily and James. Vernon just calls them weirdos who got what was coming to them, but it's Petunia who really blows up. And I think this is probably the most telling moment for Petunia about her feelings toward her sister that we get in all 7 books. Lily was the favorite child, the special one, the one her parents fawned over every year when she came home from school, but she was a freak. Also, we're told that Lily and James were head boy and girl. Lily makes sense, of course, because she's a very kind and responsible person, it seems, even when she was a teenager. James, though, that's the problem, of course. It's probably just a retcon, but in universe, we know that James was a bit of a dick until around his 7th year when he started dating Lily. But we know for a fact he was never prefect, and I suppose it's not a prerequisite to be a prefect to become head boy, but it's odd. But Hagrid fills Harry in. In this chapter, we get our first section of world building, which I think is the most endearing and fun part of the Harry Potter world. First, we get the term Muggle defined, and then when Harry reads his letter, we get all of Dumbledore's titles, such as, Order of Merlin First Class, Chief Wizengamot, etc. By the way, I can't pronounce that word, but anyway. Followed by the first real example of the wizarding method of communication, which is Outpost. We will get a lot more world building all through the series, but predominantly in this chapter, and especially next chapter, it's going to come up. Hagrid fills Harry in on what we already know about Voldemort killing Harry's parents. I won't reiterate this since I covered a lot of it in the last episode, but the pieces I do want to emphasize here is that we get our first real look into what rule under Voldemort looked like. We get this a lot more come A Goblet of Fire, though. We learn that people are still so terrified of Voldemort that most people are too afraid to say his name, which, by the way, Hagrid can't spell the word Voldemort, and I'm very confused as to why. But we also learned that people were disappearing at the time, and nobody could be trusted. Prominent magical families like the McKinnons, the Pruitts, and the Bones were all killed. Also, we re-emphasize that most people don't know why Voldemort went to the Potters in the first place. Some say maybe he was going to recruit them. Others say that they were wiped out because they were a threat. We know, however, that Fudge, McGonagall, and Flitwick at the very least knew that they were under Dumbledore's protection, so the entire story may not be a mystery to everyone, but for the common person, it seems that most people do not know anything about the events leading up to that night, which just adds more mystery to Harry's survival. All of this is very good character building and also very good world building. Finally, Vernon, who has piped up numerous times that Harry will not attend Hogwarts, finally goes too far, and like I said, he insults Harry's parents, which makes Hagrid lose his cool and round on him. Vernon, perhaps thinking that Hagrid was more bark than he was bite, puts his nail in his coffin by insulting Dumbledore by calling him an old crackpot. At this, Hagrid just loses it. We'll see in later parts of the series that Hagrid deeply respects and loves Dumbledore and will not hesitate to fight in defense of his honor. The most prominent when Karkaroff insulted Dumbledore by spitting on him and he chokeslams him against a tree. But in retaliation for this specifically, Hagrid uses his umbrella, which is just his wand in disguise, to give Dudley a pig's tail. But before the end of the chapter, we get our very first real mystery of the series that takes a while to get resolved. Hagrid's expulsion from Hogwarts. Hagrid mentions that he was expelled from Hogwarts in his 3rd year and he's not allowed to do magic, strictly speaking. Harry does inquire about this, but Hagrid changes the subject and ends the chapter. Of course, rereaders know that Hagrid was expelled due to the frame job done by Tom Riddle. I've always wondered, though, if Hagrid ever found out that Tom Riddle did this maliciously, or if he thinks Tom was simply mistaken and he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'll cover this deeply come Chamber of Secrets, but it's an interesting thought. Chapter 5, Diagon Alley, opens with Harry learning about the wizard pay system of Knuts, Sickles, and Galleons. And I'm not going to lie, I barely understand any of it, how it works. I mean, I know what the text says about it, but it's just so confusing. It never really comes up again, and it's just a very weird economic system. Finally, though, we do know that the reason magical money is made out of bronze, silver, and gold is because magic cannot recreate authentic copies of these materials. Therefore, that stops wizards from destroying their economy. We also get the school list for Hogwarts first years. We're not going to go through the entire list, but they have a school uniform, There's a list of books, most prominently A History of Magic, which comes up later in Book 7, a cauldron, a wand, and the optional animal of a cat, an owl, and a toad. We don't know why the list is restricted to that. Well, it's most likely because cats and toads are specifically considered to be magically affiliated animals, and owls are just good for, delivering mail. Ron, and before him, Percy brings Scabbers, who is definitely a rat and nothing else. Please stop asking. So it could be that the list is just a general idea of what you can bring. It's not a comprehensive list, but I don't know. Hagrid takes Harry off the rock using the rowboat. Also, how did the Dursleys get off the miniature island? Hagrid probably used apparition or a port key to go to Harry, but then they used the only viable Muggle transportation back. So, did they just swim? Well, in any case, on the way back, Hagrid is reading the British magical newspaper that we'll see from pretty much now for the rest of the series, the Daily Prophet. Hagrid mentions the Ministry for Magic for the first time to Harry, introducing the next level of this world and that there is magical politics. He also mentions Cornelius Fudge as the Minister for Magic and brings up that Fudge often requests advice from Dumbledore. Now, this whole thing is paid off at length come a Goblet of Fire and prominently in the Order of the Phoenix. And we also learned that the Ministry's main purpose is to prevent Muggles from learning about magic. And that makes sense as we see later on that most of the departments in the Ministry are things about preventing magical mishaps, restrictions on magical creatures, preventing rogue wizards, etc. After maneuvering through London, the pair eventually end up at the Leaky Cauldron. The Leaky Cauldron seems to have the Repello Muggleton charm placed on it, much like St. Mungo's and Hogwarts itself. We first see this, of course, at the Quidditch World Cup, and we also see Hermione use it as a protection charm later when the three of them are on the run, but this is most likely also where we're going to see it. Inside the Leaky Cauldron, Harry gets his first taste of Famous. Everybody from the barman Tom to the patrons inside the inn shake Harry's hand, bow, and generally just want to touch the 11-year-old boy. Please do not clip that. I did not mean it to sound like that. It is here that we are also introduced to the main antagonist of this book, Professor Quirrell. Quirrell, Hagrid says, is the professor at Hogwarts who teaches defense against the dark arts. At this point in the story, Quirrell does not have Voldemort inhabiting his body, as shown when Quirrell can shake Harry's hand without really any problem. Quirrell used to teach Muggle studies, which is an interesting fact given how he almost instantly becomes enticed with Voldemort. Before taking the post for defense, Quirrell went abroad to study more worldly dangers. Ended up in Albania where, of course, he ran into Voldemort and came into his service. Quirrell gives the excuse that he had a run-in with vampires and hags, and that makes him anxious and nervous, and that accounts for his stuttering. In reality, this is more of a play that he uses so he doesn't seem so suspicious. Really, though, I think this is just for the audience's sake, as I don't believe for a second Dumbledore fell for it. And we even see in Book 7 that Dumbledore ordered for Quirrell to be followed by Snape. Although it is a good world building to introduce magical creatures like vampires and hags, and it just all works. We do later know from a later conversation that Quirrell is here specifically on this day in Diagon Alley to capture the Sorcerer's Stone from Gringotts. Harry and Hagrid move to behind the Leaky Cauldron and enter the Diagon Alley. Also, if you don't know why it's called Diagon Alley, it's a play on the word diagonally because it's adjacent or diagonal from the Muggle world. There you go. Here we get our next great scene of world building. And one thing I personally always remember from this chapter is there's a scene while they're in Diagon Alley where a witch is complaining about the price of, I think it's a dragon's heart or a dragon's liver, maybe something like that. And it's just a very real moment of something so magical like a dragon's organ being complained about as there's a price increase. It's just all very real and it's very good. Hagrid and Harry go to Gringotts Bank, ran by goblins, so Harry can get funds for his school purchases. Now, Gringotts has a lot of magical history, and I'm not going to cover it at length here, because I feel like it'll be more thematic when we enter Deathly Hallows, and there's the Gringotts chapter. Also, for the record, I know I'm referring a lot to Deathly Hallows in this book, but Book 1 and Book 7 are mirrors of each other, and they interact often, so it's just going to be a thing. But for the sake of this book, we learned the basics of the bank. For one, you'd be mad to try to rob the bank. Their magical protections span from cavernous mazes to spells that suck would-be robbers into their vaults without any way of getting out. apparently dragons, which will never pay off, don't worry about it, as well as generally other charms and curses that would leave these without a hope. All of this is told to us in part to cement how powerful of a wizard Voldemort is, in that he manages to give Quirrell specific details on how to get in and out of the bank in order to steal the stone. Harry, Hagrid, and their goblin guide Griphook go to Hagrid's vault, where he does finally learn that he's rich. And if you're wondering why he's rich, I talked about it in my last video in part 1, go check it out. After this, they make another pit stop by Vault 713, where Hagrid picks up a small package, but he won't tell Harry what it is, but we, the reader, know that this is the titular Sorcerer's Stone. Harry goes on his shopping trip from here. We get a lot more world building, things like solid gold cauldrons, a brief view of the Nimbus 2000, a lot of potion ingredients, as well as just magical textbooks, most prominently, like I said, a history of magic, as well as the other things that come up. Harry does mention that he would like to use a spell against Dudley, but Hagrid tells him that he probably wouldn't be able to pull it off in any case, and even if he was able to, using magic against muggles is strictly forbidden, and this is when we learn that you can't use magic in the muggle world. As Hagrid goes to give Harry a birthday present, Harry goes to get his school uniforms tailored, and it is here that we are introduced to another major character in this series, Draco Malfoy. Draco is one of my personal favorite characters in this series. He has a great character arc and a great character discussion, but to be fair, in this chapter he is the absolute worst. He reminds Harry a lot of Dudley for good reason. Dudley is the muggle bully, Draco is the wizard bully. It's a parallel. For starters, he mentions for the first time in this series the concept of purebloods being better than muggleborns by saying he doesn't think they should let the other kind in, although he doesn't use those terms specifically. He also says he'd bully his father and sneaking him a broomstick since first years aren't allowed, and the final piece of awfulness that Draco inspires is that he insults Hagrid. Of course, this isn't the moment where the official line in the sand is drawn between Harry and Draco, but this does make Harry leery of him when that time does come. But from this conversation, we learned about the Hogwarts houses for the first time. Draco mentions he'll probably end up in Slytherin, and he would probably leave if he got put in Hufflepuff. A bit later, Hagrid explains these house concepts to Harry, and says Hufflepuffs are considered dudders. Also, another side point, Harry's self-esteem is put on display again by saying he'll end up in Hufflepuff. But Hagrid explains that better to be in Hufflepuff than Slytherin, as there's not been a single, bad wizard who didn't come from Slytherin, and even Voldemort himself did. Also, Draco mentions Quidditch for the first time here, and Hagrid says it's too complicated to explain, but this is a good tease for the concept later in the book. The final scene that takes place in Diagon Alley is probably one of the most important in the entire series. Harry's purchase of his wand from Mr. Ollivander. Mr. Ollivander is an interesting character, as he seems to be true neutral a lot of the times. He does not agree with Voldemort's actions, for example, but he does recognize them to be great, and has a certain amount of pride in the fact that one of his wands was used for that success. Ollivander was founded in 382 BC, and while it's certain that the same Garrick Ollivander that ran the shop back then is not the same one that runs it now, it is telling that the audience probably wouldn't question it if Ollivander wasn't an immortal agent of neutrality, providing tools and magical conductors. He's creepy, he's intelligent, and he's a good character, and I wish we got more of him. Also, just as a side, it's pretty much confirmed here that Hagrid's snapped wand is hidden in the umbrella. And I'm a fan of the theory that Dumbledore used the Elder Wand to repair Hagrid's wand and put it in the umbrella as a kind of fix of justice, since Dumbledore suspected Hagrid's innocence. But unlike most people who meet Harry for the first time who act in awe, Ollivander seems to be more expectant of Harry. He takes his measurements and begins to have Harry try out various wands. I always found it odd that Ollivander, who is an expert in wand lore, didn't try the Holly wand immediately. Or at the very least, I think the natural curiosity would have Ollivander make the second Phoenix Feather wand the first try. The only way I can rationalize this is Ollivander wanted to test Harry's proclivity for other wands first, to see if the boy was indeed special or just lucky. Now, I don't know all that, but it's just my headcanon. But, of course, the wand that chooses Harry is an 11-inch wand made of holly wood with a phoenix feather core. The phoenix, which we will later find out was Fox, actually gave up 2 feathers to produce a second wand. The second wand would become Lord Voldemort's wand, thus making Lord Voldemort and Harry's wands brothers. This comes with a lot of repercussions, such as priori incantatem, to Voldemort beginning his quest for the Elder Wand, and more. And we'll talk about each of those things as they come up in the story. And the next scene, the last scene of the chapter, has Harry and Hagrid leave Diagon Alley and get a bite to eat. Harry expresses his concern that everyone is expecting so much of him and he knows so little of magic or even the wizarding world. Hagrid shows, not for the first time, but I think this is the sweetest up to this point, says that he shows how amazing of a friend he is. He reassures Harry that all students start out at the same point more or less when they get to Hogwarts. And yeah, sure, he'd been picked out of the crowd, but don't let that fact make him feel any lesser than who he really is. It's very sweet, and I love my boy Hagrid. At this, Hagrid gives Harry his ticket to the Hogwarts Express. Now, this is definitely a book one-ism, as there's never any mention of a specific ticket to get on the train. Maybe you could argue that the platform is protected by the Fidelius charm, and the train ticket is written by somebody, maybe the current headmaster, who is the secret keeper, thus giving the ticket holder access to the platform. But who knows, that's just me trying to explain something that doesn't have an explanation. After giving Harry his ticket and telling him to get on the platform on September 1st, Hagrid apparently disapparates, leaving the young 11-year-old boy in the middle of London with no Muggle money to get back to Privet Drive, which I estimate is at least 25 miles away. So yeah, good on you. But thus, we end our discussion on chapters 3 through 5 of Sorcerer's Stone. In honesty, this is not my favorite section of this book. For rereaders, it definitely feels like we're just stalling until we get to Hogwarts. And I know we have to establish the world before we can get to the masterpiece of said world. And I do love that world building, but a lot of this on reread does feel like bookkeeping. For the record, I do love Goblet and Order, which both take a lot of time to get to Hogwarts also. But there's also a lot of other stuff going on in those books. And by that point, I've also spent 3 full years at the school, so the yearning isn't as bad. But all the same, I did enjoy these chapters for, the humor of Uncle Vernon smashing a fruitcake against a nail, to the fist pumping, you're a wizard Harry moments, to just the establishment of the wizarding world in general. In all honesty, I hope you enjoyed. Next time, we'll be covering chapters 6 through 9 of Sorcerer's Stone, and I hope you can join me for that next time on The Nerdscape.